The gunshot shattered the dawn silence. Clara Whitlock's hands froze over the pie dough, flour dusting her knuckles like fresh snow. Outside her cabin window, three men circled a lone woman in the street, miners drunk on whiskey and entitlement. The woman's scream cut through the Colorado morning. Clara's fingers found the rifle beneath her workbench. This was the moment that would define everything, the choice between the safety of her locked door and the dangerous truth. In this godforsaken mining town, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about deciding what kind of woman you'd become. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's journey travels. The Armor of Solitude. The Colorado Territory, 1883, wore its brutality like a badge of honor. Silver Ridge wasn't a town so much as a wound in the mountainside, a gash of desperation carved by men chasing metal in the earth. Wooden structures clung to the slopes like broken teeth, crooked and weather-beaten. The main street ran thick with mud 9 months of the year, frozen solid the other 3. Saloons outnumbered churches 5-1. Women were scarce, law was scarcer. And in a tiny cabin at the edge of this chaos, Clara Whitlock woke every morning at 4:30, lit her stove, and began the only battle she knew she could win. Pie. Not just any pie. Clara's pies had developed a reputation that transcended the usual frontier fare. Her crust shattered like glass under a fork, buttery and impossibly flaky. Her fillings, whether apple, cherry, or the wild huckleberry she foraged in the high country, achieved a perfect balance between sweet and tart that made hardened miners weak in the knees. In a world of burned biscuits and leather-tough steak, Clara's pies were proof that beauty could still exist. She worked alone in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements precise and economical. Flour, lard, ice water measured to the drop. Her hands knew the texture of perfect dough by feel alone. She'd made it so many times that thought had become muscle memory. Roll, fold, turn, roll, fold, turn. The rhythm was meditation, protection, purpose. The cabin around her was small but immaculate. One room divided by function rather than walls, sleeping area, cooking area, workspace. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. No decoration except what was necessary. No softness except what could be justified. The floor was swept twice daily. The dishes washed immediately after use. The bed made with military corners. Control was survival. Clara had learned that lesson the hard way. She was 23 years old and had been alone for 2 years, though in truth she'd been preparing for solitude her entire life. Her parents, Samuel and Margaret Whitlock, had been missionaries with a wagon full of good intentions and dangerously little practical sense. They'd come west to bring civilization to the frontier, as her father had proclaimed with the confidence of a man who'd never actually met the frontier. The frontier had introduced itself with typhoid fever. Claire had nursed them both through the delirium, the fever, the final gasping hours. She'd buried them in the rocky soil behind what was now her cabin, what had been their mission outpost. She'd been 21. She'd cried for exactly 1 night, and then she'd gotten to work. Because the alternative was death, violation, or marriage to one of the desperate men who saw a lone woman as opportunity rather than person. Clara chose none of those options. Instead, she chose pie. The idea had come from necessity. She had her mother's recipes, her father's tools, and a population of miners who subsisted primarily on beans, bacon, and whiskey. A hot meal was a luxury. A good hot meal was a miracle. A slice of pie that reminded them of home, of mothers and sweethearts, and a world before the endless dark of the mines, that was worth paying for. She'd started small. 5 pies sold outside the general store. The money had bought flour and lard for 5 more. Those sold in hours. Within a month, she had a system. Within 3 months, she had customers who placed orders in advance. Within 6 months, she had enough saved to make it through the winter. Within a year, she had something more valuable than money: respect. It was a grudging, conditional respect, the kind men gave to a woman who made herself useful enough to tolerate, but not so visible as to invite interference. Clara understood the rules. She kept her head down. She spoke only when necessary. She never lingered in public spaces. She never made eye contact she didn't have to make. She dressed in dark, practical colors. She wore her blonde hair in a severe bun. She moved through town like a ghost with a purpose. And she always carried a knife. It was strapped to her thigh beneath her skirt. a 6-inch blade her father had used for carpentry. She'd sharpened it until it could split a hair. She'd never had to use it, but the weight of it against her leg was a constant reminder. She would, if she had to. The morning of the gunshot started like any other. Clara had 4 pies in the oven, 2 apple, 2 cherry. The scent filled the cabin, rich and sweet, cutting through the pine smoke from the stove. She was rolling dough for the afternoon batch when the sound cracked through the air. Gunfire wasn't uncommon in Silver Ridge. Miners settling disputes, drunks making noise, the occasional robbery. Clara's policy was simple, not her problem. She had locks on her door, bars on her windows, and a rifle loaded and ready. Whatever happened out there stayed out there. But then came the scream. A woman's scream. Clara's hands stilled. She looked toward the window, the one that faced the main street, currently covered with a thin muslin curtain. Through it, she could see shadows moving, hear voices raised in laughter. Male voices. Another scream, higher, more desperate. Clara's jaw clenched. Not your problem, she told herself. You've survived 2 years by minding your own business. Don't stop now. But her feet carried her to the window anyway. She peeled back the curtain just enough to see. 3 men surrounded a woman in the middle of the street. Clara recognized them, miners from the Lucky Strike, one of the deeper shafts. Day shift workers who'd apparently started drinking early. The woman was young, maybe 18, wearing a faded calico dress and clutching a basket of laundry. Clara had seen her before, one of the washerwomen who worked out of the boarding house. One of the men grabbed her arm. She pulled back, dropping the basket, clothes spilled into the mud. "Come on now, darlin'," one of the miners slurred, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Just one dance. Ain't asking much." "Please," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I need to get to work." "Work can wait." Another miner stepped closer, blocking her retreat. "We got wages to spend. Pretty girl like you could make more in an hour with us than washing some bastard's drawers all week." The implication was clear. Clara's hand moved to the rifle beneath her workbench. This is how women disappear, she thought. This is how we become cautionary tales. The street was empty except for the 4 of them. Dawn was just breaking. The responsible men were already in the mines, the irresponsible ones still sleeping off yesterday's whiskey. The few businesses that lined the street were dark, doors closed. No one was coming to help, no one except Clara. She grabbed the rifle, checked the load, and moved to the door. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was not. "You're going to get yourself killed," a voice in her head warned. "You've survived this long by being invisible. The moment you step out there, you become visible. You become a target." But the woman screamed again, and Clara unlocked the door. The cold morning air hit her like a slap. October in the high country meant frost on the ground and breath visible in the air. Clara stepped onto her small porch, rifle raised to her shoulder, and spoke with a voice that carried like a church bell. "Step away from her." 4 heads turned. The miners looked confused at first, as if they couldn't quite process the sight of a woman pointing a rifle at them. Then one of them laughed. "Well, look at this," he said, swaying slightly. "The pie lady's got teeth." "I said step away." Clara's finger rested against the trigger guard. Not on the trigger, not yet, but close enough to make the point. "She's not interested, move along." "This ain't your concern," another miner said, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Girls just being friendly. Ain't that right, sweetheart?" The washerwoman took the opportunity to bolt. She grabbed her basket and ran, clothes forgotten in the mud, disappearing down an alley between buildings. The miners watched her go, then turned their attention fully to Clara. "Now that's just rude," the first miner said, starting toward Clara's porch. "Cost us our entertainment. Reckon you owe us compensation." Clara pulled the hammer back on the rifle. The click was loud in the quiet street. "I reckon you should reconsider your direction of travel," she said calmly. "This rifle's got a hair trigger, and I haven't had my coffee yet. Makes me jumpy." The miner stopped. His 2 companions flanked him, forming a loose semicircle. They were calculating now, weighing their odds, their pride, their level of intoxication against the very real possibility of getting shot. "You ain't gonna shoot nobody," one of them said, but he didn't sound convinced. "You willing to bet your life on that assumption?" Clara asked. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. The rifle did the talking. A long moment stretched between them. Then, From down the street, a voice called out, "Problem here, gentlemen?" Claire's eyes flicked to the side, just for a second, and saw a figure approaching on horseback. A man, silhouetted against the rising sun, broad-shouldered and moving with the easy confidence of someone used to being listened to. The miners saw him too. Whatever calculation they'd been running suddenly included new variables. 3 drunk miners versus 1 woman with a rifle was one kind of odds. 3 drunk miners versus a woman with a rifle and an unknown man on horseback was another. "No problem," the first miner muttered, "just having a conversation." "Looked like more than conversation from where I was sitting," the man said, riding closer. His voice was deep, measured, with a drawl that suggested Texas or maybe Kansas. "Saw the whole thing from the livery. Saw you boys harassing that young lady. Saw this lady here convince you to reconsider your choices. Seems to me the conversation's over." The miners exchanged glances. Their moment of opportunity had passed. The street was waking up now. A door opened across the way. Someone peered out of a window. Witnesses meant consequences. "Ain't worth the trouble," one of them said. They turned and shambled away, muttering curses and insults that were meant to save face but only underlined their retreat. Claire kept the rifle raised until they disappeared around a corner. Then, and only then, did she lower it, her hands beginning to tremble with the adrenaline she'd been suppressing. "You all right, ma'am?" She looked up at the man on horseback. He'd stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 30, maybe more, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He wore range clothes that had seen real work, not the costume of a town dandy, and he sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. "I'm fine," Claire said, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. "Thank you for the assistance." "Seemed like you had it handled," he said, tipping his hat. "I was just providing additional motivation for those boys to make the smart choice." Clara didn't respond. She turned to go back inside. "Name's Colt Mercer," he said to her, retreating back. "Just rode in this morning looking for work. Don't suppose you know if any of the ranches nearby are hiring?" Clara paused at her door. Every instinct told her to walk inside, lock the door, and pretend this conversation never happened. Getting involved with strangers, especially male strangers, was exactly the kind of complication she'd spent 2 years avoiding. But he had helped. And she had a policy about debts. "Try the Double R, 5 miles north," she said without turning around. "Ask for Thomas Riley. Tell him Clara sent you. He's always looking for hands who can actually work." "Appreciate that," Colt said. "And your name would be Clara?" "Whitlock." She opened her door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have pies burning." She stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind her, leaning against it for just a moment as her heart continued its hammering rhythm. "What were you thinking?" she demanded of herself. "Getting involved like that? Drawing attention? You could have been killed." But through the window, she could see the washerwoman peeking out from the alley where she'd hidden, safe and unharmed. Clara returned to her workbench and pulled the pies from the oven. Not burned, just perfectly golden. She set them on the cooling rack and started on the next batch, her hands moving through the familiar motion, seeking comfort in routine. Outside, she heard the sound of hoofbeats as Colt Mercer rode away. She told herself she'd never see him again. She was wrong. Boss. 3 days later, he walked into her cabin with a slice of sky in his eyes and money in his hand. "Heard you sell the best pie in the territory," Colt said, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. "Figured I should confirm that claim personally." Clara looked up from the dough she was rolling. She'd been half expecting this. Men who helped women often expected payment beyond gratitude, but something in his stance suggested genuine interest rather than leverage. "Pie's 50 cents a slice, 75 if you want it warm," she said, not pausing in her work. "Take your order around to the window. I don't conduct business inside." "Fair enough." But he didn't move. "Though I should mention, got the job at the Double R. Thomas Riley said any man you'd vouch for was worth a trial period. Wanted to say thank you proper." Clara's hand stilled. She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered. "I didn't vouch for you. I gave you information. What you did with it was your own business." "That how you see it?" Colt smiled, and it transformed his face from merely weathered to something approaching handsome. "Way Thomas tells it, you don't give recommendations lightly. Said in 2 years you've spoken to him exactly 3 times, and one of those was to warn him about a horse trader selling lame mounts. Says when Clara Whitlock offers information, it's gold. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment at being discussed, anger at being made visible. Thomas talks too much. Thomas talks just enough, Colt countered. Says you're the hardest worker in the territory and twice as smart as any man who's tried to court you, which is apparently most of them. Then Thomas should also have told you I'm not interested in being courted. Clara returned to her dough with perhaps more force than necessary. The windows around the side, 50 cents for apple, 75 for cherry. Colt put his hat back on, tipping it slightly. Apple, please. And I'll take it warm if the offer stands. He left through the front and appeared at the side window a moment later. Clara wrapped a generous slice of apple pie in wax paper and handed it through, accepting his coins without comment. Obliged, Colt said, and walked away to eat his pie on the bench outside the general store. Clara watched him through her window, irritated with herself for watching. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Always polite, always respectful of her boundaries, always paying exact change. He'd order pie, they'd exchange perhaps a dozen words, and he'd leave. Sometimes he'd eat on the bench. Sometimes he'd take it with him, presumably back to the Double R. After a week, Clara's irritation evolved into reluctant curiosity. After 2 weeks, she found herself anticipating his visits in a way that felt dangerous. You work every day? Colt asked on his 15th visit, accepting his slice of cherry pie. His preference had shifted after trying both. Every day there's flour to buy and winter to prepare for, Clara said. Out here, you work or you starve. There's no middle ground. No day of rest? Rest is for people with safety nets. Clara wrapped a second slice without being asked. He'd started buying 2, claiming one was for Thomas. I don't have that luxury. Colt counted out his coins, then added an extra quarter to the pile. That's too much, Clara said immediately. For the information about the horse trader, Colt explained. Saved the ranch a bad deal last week. Thomas said to make sure you got a share of the savings. Clara pushed the quarter back. I don't take charity. It's not charity, it's business. You provided valuable information. Information has value. Colt pushed the quarter back toward her. Unless you're suggesting your information isn't worth paying for. It was a neat trap, and Clara recognized it as such. She picked up the quarter and dropped it in her cash box with a sound of metal on metal. Tell Thomas he's paid up, she said. I'll tell him, Colt agreed. Though between you and me, I think he was hoping you'd refuse so he'd have an excuse to try again. Man's got a stubborn streak when it comes to paying debts. Seems to be contagious, Clara said dryly. Colt grinned. Maybe. Or maybe some of us were raised to believe that when someone helps you, you don't forget it. He left before she could respond, but the words stayed with her through the afternoon, mixing with flour dust and the scent of baking fruit. The routine continued. Every day, same time, late morning after he'd finished his early work at the ranch, but before the midday rush began. Clara found herself timing her baking so there'd be fresh pie cooling when he arrived. She told herself it was just good business practice. But good business practice didn't explain why her heart rate picked up when she heard hoofbeats on the road. It was on the 21st day that the routine changed. Colt arrived as usual, but instead of ordering immediately, he lingered at the window. Question for you, he said. And you can tell me it's none of my business because it probably isn't, but I'm going to ask anyway. Clara set down her rolling pin. Ask. Why pie? She blinked. What? Why pie, specifically? Colt leaned against the window frame, genuinely curious. You're smart, capable, clearly good with your hands. You could have done 100 different things to survive out here. Why choose baking? No one had ever asked her that. Men bought pie, ate pie, complimented pie, but none of them had ever wondered about the choice behind it. Clara found herself answering honestly. Because it's something I could control, she said slowly. After my parents died, everything felt chaotic, dangerous, out of my hands. But pie has rules, ratios that work, techniques that produce consistent results. If you do it right, you get the same outcome every time. It's not random. It's not luck, it's skill and knowledge and discipline. She stopped, surprised by how much she'd revealed. Colt nodded slowly. Makes sense. World's easier to handle when at least one part of it behaves predictably. Exactly. Clara picked up her rolling pin again, needing something to do with her hands. Plus, everyone needs to eat. Pie made me useful without making me vulnerable. Men don't threaten what feeds them. Is that what you think? Colt's voice had gone quiet. That you're only safe as long as you're useful? Clara met his eyes through the window. I think safety is an illusion out here, Mr. Mercer. Usefulness is just the best illusion available. It's Colt, he said. And for what it's worth, I think you're wrong. About which part? All of it. He straightened up. But I'm not fool enough to think I can change your mind in one conversation. So I'll just take my usual order and hope you'll keep thinking about it. He paid, took his pie, and walked to his bench. But Clara did keep thinking about it. Through the afternoon baking. Through her evening routine. Through the lonely hours of the night when the cabin felt too quiet and the walls pressed in with memories of all the conversations she never had. What if he was right? What if safety wasn't just an illusion? What if there were other ways to exist in this world beyond the constant vigilance she'd maintained for 2 years? The thoughts were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. Wanting anything beyond survival was a crack in her armor, and cracks let in cold and chaos. But the thoughts persisted. The next morning, when Colt arrived, Clara had a question ready. "Why do you come here every day?" she asked as she handed him his pie. "There's pie at the boarding house. Closer to the ranch, cheaper too." Colt accepted the wrapped slice, but didn't walk away. "You really want to know?" "I wouldn't ask if I didn't." "Because the pie here tastes like someone cares," he said simply. "Every crust perfect, every slice exact, every interaction honest. You don't pretend to be something you're not, and you don't sell something you don't believe in. That's rare out here. Maybe rare anywhere." Well, Clara felt something twist in her chest. Part pleasure, part panic. "It's just pie," she said. "No," Colt said gently. "It's not." He left, and Clara stood at her window watching him go, her hands gripping the sill so hard her knuckles went white. "It's just pie," she told herself. "Just flour and fruit and butter, nothing more." But she knew, deep in the place she tried hardest to ignore, that he'd seen something she'd tried to hide even from herself. She didn't just bake to survive. She baked because it was the only way she knew how to say, "I'm still here. I still believe things can be beautiful. I haven't given up." And Colt Mercer had heard what she wasn't saying. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind howl through the mountain passes. Winter was coming early this year. She could feel it in the air, see it in the early snow dusting the peaks. Soon the passes would close and Silver Ridge would be cut off from the outside world until spring. 4 months of isolation. 4 months of the same faces, the same struggles, the same grinding survival. 4 months of seeing Colt Mercer every day. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, buried beneath layers of caution and self-protection, Clara felt something she hadn't allowed herself in 2 years. Anticipation. She fell asleep imagining conversations they might have, questions she might dare to ask. The sound of laughter, her laughter, mixing with the crackle of her stove and the whistle of winter wind. Dangerous thoughts. Wonderful thoughts. Outside, the first real snow began to fall, transforming the harsh mining town into something briefly beautiful. And in her small cabin at the edge of civilization, Clara Whitlock dreamed of possibilities she'd sworn she'd never want. The armor she'd built so carefully was developing cracks. And for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't sure she wanted to repair them. The first heavy snow came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into November, and with it came a shift in the delicate balance Clara had maintained. She woke to find her cabin buried in 18 inches of fresh powder, the world outside transformed into a blank canvas that erased all the familiar landmarks. The path to town was invisible. The road to the Double R Ranch had disappeared beneath a white expanse that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Even sound was different, muffled, intimate, as if the snow had wrapped the entire world in cotton wool. Clara lit her stove and began her morning routine, but her mind kept returning to a single question. Would Colt come today? The distance from the ranch was 5 miles. Difficult riding in good weather, potentially deadly in this. No one would blame him for staying put, waiting for the storm to pass and the roads to clear. It would be the sensible thing to do. But when mid-morning arrived, so did the sound of hoofbeats crunching through snow. Clara's heart jumped before she could stop it. She forced herself to continue rolling dough, to not rush to the window like some desperate fool. But when the knock came at her side window, not his usual polite clearing of throat, but an actual knock, she abandoned the pretense and went. Colt stood there covered in snow, his hat white with it, his coat dusted like a miller's apron. His cheeks were wind-burned red and his breath came in visible clouds, but he was grinning. "Morning," he said. "Hope you've got coffee to go with that pie today. Feels like my bones turned to ice somewhere around mile 3. Clara stared at him. "You rode 5 miles in a blizzard for pie?" "Not just any pie," Colt said. "Your pie. There's a difference." "You could have died." "Could have," he agreed cheerfully. "Didn't, though. Horse knows the route now, and I've ridden through worse." Montana winter of 79 makes this look like a spring shower. He stomped his boots, shaking off snow. "So about that coffee?" Clara made a decision that surprised herself. "Come inside." Colt's eyebrows rose. "You sure? I know I've got rules about not letting fools freeze to death on my conscience," Clara interrupted. "You're tracking snow everywhere anyway. Might as well track it indoors where it's warm." She unlatched the door and stepped back, her heart hammering at the transgression of her own carefully constructed boundaries. Colt entered slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might spook her. He removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the peg by the door Clara indicated. Underneath, his clothes were work-worn but clean, and he moved through her small space with careful awareness of how much room he took up. "Sit," Clara said, gesturing to one of the 2 chairs at her small table. "I'll get coffee." She poured from the pot she kept warm on the stove, her hand steady despite the strangeness of having someone in her space. A man in her space. For the first time in 2 years, her cabin felt smaller and larger simultaneously. Smaller because he filled it with his presence, larger because suddenly it wasn't just hers anymore. "Thank you," Colt said, wrapping his cold hands around the mug. He took a sip and closed his eyes. Heaven. Pure heaven. Oh. Clara returned to her workbench, needing the familiar routine to anchor herself. She cut a slice of apple pie, fresh from the morning batch, and slid it across the table with a fork. "On the house," she said when he reached for coins. "Hazard pay for risking your life for baked goods." Colt chuckled. "If I'd known life-threatening behavior earned free pie, I'd have done something dramatic weeks ago." He took a bite and made a sound of appreciation that sent unexpected warmth through Clara's chest. "Though I should clarify, I didn't risk my life for pie. I risked it because I gave my word I'd be here, and I don't break my word." "You never actually promised to come every day." "Didn't I?" Colt met her eyes over the rim of his coffee mug. "Maybe not in words, but there's all kinds of promises, Clara. Some you speak, some you just keep." She turned back to her dough, not trusting herself to respond. The intimacy of the moment, the warmth of the cabin, the quiet of the snow outside, the simple act of sharing space and warmth felt both precious and terrifying. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes. Clara rolled and folded, rolled and folded. Colt finished his pie and nursed his coffee, watching her work with unconcealed interest. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "You're going to regardless of my answer." "True enough," he smiled. "But I'll ask permission anyway. What did your parents think about you learning to bake like this? This wasn't something you picked up after they died. You're too good. This is years of practice." Clara's hands stilled. She'd expected questions about her solitude, her business, her future, not about the past she'd tried to bury along with her parents. "My mother taught me," she said after a long moment. "She believed that a woman should be capable in all domestic arts, cooking, sewing, preserving, healing. She said those skills were what separated civilization from chaos." Sounds like a practical woman. "She was a dreamer married to another dreamer," Clara corrected. "My father believed in bringing enlightenment to the frontier through faith and education. My mother believed in it through teaching women to be self-sufficient. They were both wrong about how the world works, but at least her skills were transferable." Bitterness crept into her voice unbidden. She tried to suppress it, but Colt had already heard. "You're angry at them," he observed quietly. It wasn't a question. Clara's jaw clenched. "I'm alive because of the skills my mother taught me. I'm alone because of the dreams my father chased. I'm not sure if that balances out to gratitude or anger, so I try not to think about it. Oh, that's a lonely way to live. Lonely is better than dead. Is it? Colt set down his mug. Because from where I'm sitting, you're doing both. Living alone's so hard you might as well be dead to the world. The words hit like a slap. Clara spun to face him, flour dusting her hands, her eyes flashing with sudden fury. You don't know anything about my life or my choices, she said, her voice low and sharp. You've been here a month. I've been surviving here for 2 years. Don't presume to understand what that requires. Colt didn't flinch. You're right. I don't understand, so help me understand. Explain to me why a woman as strong and capable as you has to live like she's in a siege. Because I am in a siege. The words burst out of Clara before she could stop them. Every single day is a battle to maintain the illusion that I'm not vulnerable, that I don't need protection or guidance or rescue. The moment I show weakness, the moment I admit I'm lonely or scared or tired of fighting, that's the moment someone decides I need to be saved. And the cost of being saved is my freedom. She was breathing hard now, 2 years of suppressed emotion rising to the surface like water through cracked ice. I've had 7 proposals since my parents died, she continued, her voice shaking. 7 men who looked at me and saw an opportunity. A woman alone with property and skills ripe for the taking. They dressed it up as concern, as offers of protection, but what they meant was ownership. Marriage as transaction. My labor, my body, my entire existence traded for the promise of safety I'd have to depend on them to provide. Clara turned away, pressing her palms flat against the workbench. So yes, I live like I'm in a siege. Because I am. And the moment I forget that is the moment I lose everything I've fought to keep. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of snow against the windows. When Colt finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. I'm not asking you to marry me, Clara. I'm asking you to let me be your friend. She looked at him over her shoulder. Why? Because friendship doesn't cost freedom, he said simply. Because I think you're extraordinary, and I enjoy your company, and I'd like to know you better. Not possess you, not save you, just know you. Men don't want friendship from women. This man does. Colt stood, carrying his mug to the wash basin. Though I'll admit my motives aren't entirely pure, I'm hoping if we're friends you'll teach me how to make pie crust that doesn't turn out like leather. Despite herself, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. That's a tall order. Some people just don't have the touch for pastry. Then I'll settle for good conversation and the occasional slice of pie. He shrugged into his coat. The storm's letting up. I should head back before Thomas sends out a search party. Clara walked him to the door, something loosening in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Colt, she said as he reached for the latch. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. Tomorrow. If you come tomorrow, I'll teach you the basics of pie crust. But you have to promise not to complain when I critique your technique. His face split into a grin that transformed him from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. Deal. Though I warn you, my sister once said I had the culinary instincts of a particularly stupid rock. I'll adjust my expectations accordingly. He left, trudging through the snow toward where his horse waited, patient and snow-covered. Clara watched from her window until he disappeared into the white landscape, then returned to her baking with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She was taking a risk, she knew that. Opening her door, her space, her carefully guarded solitude to someone else was dangerous. But as she worked through the afternoon, she found herself humming, an old tune her mother used to sing while kneading bread. The siege walls were still standing, but she'd opened a window. Maybe that was enough for now. True to his word, Colt returned the next day, and the day after that. The weather remained brutal. Winter had settled over Silver Ridge like a wolf on a kill, determined and unyielding. But Colt rode through it all, arriving each morning with snow in his hair and determination in his eyes. And Clara taught him to make pie. No, you're overworking it, she said on the 3rd lesson, watching him massacre another batch of dough. Pastry requires a light touch. You're strangling it. I'm following your instructions exactly, Colt protested, holding up flour-covered hands. You're following the words. You're missing the feeling. Clara moved beside him, taking his hands in hers. They were larger than hers, rougher, scarred from years of ranch work. She guided them through the motion, the gentle folding, the careful turn. Like this. You're not fighting the dough, you're coaxing it. Colt went very still at her touch. Clara realized what she'd done. The casual intimacy of the gesture, the closeness of their bodies. She should have stepped back, should have maintained the distance she'd worked so hard to preserve, but she didn't. Better, she said softly, her hand still covering his. Do you feel the difference? Yeah, Colt said, his voice rougher than usual. I feel it. They stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, flour dust hanging in the air between them like snow, the cabin warm and close and suddenly charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Clara stepped back first, clearing her throat. Keep practicing. I'll prepare the filling. The lessons continued. Some days Colt made progress. Most days he didn't. His crust remained stubbornly tough, his edges crimped unevenly, his timing perpetually off. But Clara suspected he wasn't trying that hard to improve. The lessons had become an excuse, a framework that allowed them to spend time together without the weight of expectation or judgment. Between instructions, they talked. Colt told her about his childhood in Texas, about a father who drank and a mother who endured, about siblings scattered across the West chasing their own versions of survival. He spoke of years spent driving cattle, of nights under stars so thick they seemed close enough to touch, of the particular loneliness that came from always moving, never settling. I got tired of it, he said one afternoon, rolling dough with slightly more success than usual. The drifting. Started to feel like I was running from something instead of toward something. Figured it was time to find a place and make it mine. Why here? Clara asked. Silver Ridge isn't exactly paradise. No, but it's real, Colt said. The work is honest. The people are straightforward, and the land doesn't lie. You know where you stand. That's worth more than paradise to me. Clara found herself sharing in return, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. She told him about her parents' mission, about the crushing weight of their expectations, about the relief and guilt she'd felt when they died, about the terror of being alone and the strange freedom that came with it. I spent my whole childhood being told what I should be, she admitted. Pious, obedient, selfless. My mother loved me, but she loved the idea of who I could become more. When they died, I was devastated, but I was also free for the first time in my life. And you chose pie, Colt said with a small smile. I chose survival. The pie was just the method. Clara paused, considering. Though I suppose there's truth in your observation. I could have chosen a dozen different paths to survival. But pie was mine. Not a duty or an expectation, a choice. Best choice you ever made, if you ask me, Colt said. Though I might be biased. The weeks folded into each other, measured by snowfall and batches of pie and conversations that grew longer and more personal. Clara found herself looking forward to mornings not just as work time, but as Colt time. She started preparing extra coffee. She began wearing her mother's blue dress on occasion instead of always the practical brown. She caught herself laughing, actual, genuine laughter, at his stories and observations. The town noticed. Heard you've got yourself a regular customer, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house said one afternoon, her tone heavy with implication. She'd stopped by to purchase pies for a special dinner, and her eyes scanned Clara's cabin like she was searching for evidence of scandal. I have several regular customers, Clara replied evenly. Pie is popular. Not pie that requires private lessons, Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing look. People talk, dear. A young woman and a cowboy, alone in a cabin every day. It creates impressions. Clara felt ice slide down her spine. My business is my own, Mrs. Henderson, and there's nothing improper happening in my cabin. I'm sure there isn't, the older woman said, but her tone suggested the opposite. I'm just saying, for your own protection, you might want to consider appearances. A woman's reputation is her most valuable asset, especially out here. After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara stood at her window and watched the sun set over the snow-covered mountains. The warning had been clear: stop seeing Colt or face the consequences of gossip and innuendo. The old Clara, the one who'd survived 2 years by making herself invisible, would have listened, would have closed her door, ended the lessons, returned to her careful isolation. But something had shifted inside her over the past weeks. The armor she'd built had developed too many cracks to be repaired, and she was discovering that she didn't want to repair it. When Colt arrived the next morning, Clara met him at the door with a decision made. "We need to talk," she said. His smile faded. "That's never a good opening." "The town is talking about us," Clara said bluntly. "About the time we spend together. About impropriety and reputation." Colt's jaw tightened. "I see. And you're worried about what they're saying." "I'm worried about what it means," Clara corrected. "For both of us. You could lose your position at the ranch if Thomas thinks you're compromising a woman's virtue. I could lose customers, respect, safety." "So what are you saying?" Clara took a breath. "I'm saying we need to make a choice. Either we stop these lessons and go back to brief transactions through the window, or we acknowledge what this actually is and deal with the consequences." "And what is this, Clara?" Colt asked quietly. "What would you call it?" She met his eyes, her heart pounding. "I'd call it courting, if I'm being honest. You've been courting me without calling it that, and I've been letting you, and now the whole town knows it except us." Colt stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "And if I called it that? If I asked formally to court you properly and publicly, what would you say?" "I'd say yes," Clara whispered. "And I'd be terrified. And I'd mean it anyway." "Then I'm asking." Colt reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Clara Whitlock, I'd like permission to court you. Openly, honestly, with the intention of building something real between us. I know you value your independence. I'm not asking you to give that up. I'm asking you to share it. With me." Clara looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers dusted with flour, both of them marked by the work of survival. This was the moment, the choice she'd been avoiding since the day she'd stepped onto her porch with a rifle to defend a stranger. She could say no, could retreat behind her walls and her rules and her carefully constructed safety, could spend the rest of her life baking pies alone, untouchable and untouched. Or she could say yes. Could take the terrifying leap into trust and vulnerability and hope. Could risk everything she'd built for the chance at something more. "Yes," Clara said, squeezing his hand, "you have permission to court me, but I have conditions." Colt's face broke into that transformative grin. "I'd expect nothing less." "Name them." "I keep my cabin, my business, my independence. This doesn't mean I become your property or your responsibility. It means we choose to spend time together, to know each other, to see if what's growing between us can survive in full sunlight." "Agreed." "I won't be rushed into anything. No pressure for quick decisions or promises I'm not ready to make." "Agreed." "And if at any point this stops working, if either of us isn't happy, we end it honestly. No drama, no recriminations, no making each other pay for changing our minds." Colt's expression sobered. "That's the one I can't promise." Clara's stomach dropped. "What?" "I can promise not to rush you. I can promise to respect your independence, but I can't promise that ending this won't hurt. Because it would, Clara. It already would, and we've barely started." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her flour-dusted knuckles. "So how about this instead? I promise that if it ends, I'll do my damnedest to let you go with grace. But I also promise to do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't end." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Unexpected, unwanted, unstoppable. "That's not fair. You're supposed to be reasonable about this." "Nothing about how I feel about you is reasonable," Colt said. "But I'll be honest. That's the best I can do." She pulled her hand free and wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I don't cry. I haven't cried in 2 years." "Then I'm honored to be worth breaking that streak," Colt said gently. Clara laughed despite herself, a wet, slightly hysterical sound. "You're impossible." "I prefer determined." He stepped back, giving her space to collect herself. "So, now that we're officially courting, what happens next?" "Next, you learn to crimp a pie edge properly," Clara said, returning to familiar ground. "Because if you're going to be seen with me publicly, I won't have it said that I'm courting a man who can't even finish a basic pastry." They returned to their lesson, but everything felt different now. The air seemed lighter. The cabin felt warmer. Even the endless Colorado winter outside seemed less oppressive. Word spread through Silver Ridge faster than fire through dry timber. By evening, Everyone knew that the pie lady and the new ranch hand were courting. Opinions formed immediately and vocally. Some approved, Thomas Riley among them, who apparently told anyone who'd listen that he'd seen this coming from day one and that Colt was lucky to have caught Clara's interest. The few other women in town expressed cautious support, perhaps seeing in Clara's choice a validation of their own risks in coming west. Others disapproved. Mrs. Henderson led this faction, citing the speed of the courtship, the impropriety of the private lessons, the general unseemliness of a woman choosing her own suitor rather than weighing all available options. And some men, particularly those who'd proposed to Clara and been rejected, reacted with barely concealed anger. The confrontation came 5 days after Clara and Colt made their courtship public. Clara was closing her shutters for the night when 3 men approached her cabin. She recognized them immediately. Jacob Morrison, who'd proposed 6 months after her parents died and taken her rejection as a personal insult. Frank Dewey, who'd offered marriage as a business arrangement and seemed baffled when she'd refused. And Peter Hollis, whose proposal had come with the caveat that she'd have to give up baking and focus on proper wifely duties. "Evening, Clara," Jacob said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man trying to control his anger. "Heard the news about you and Mercer. Wanted to offer congratulations." Clara's hand moved to the rifle she kept loaded by the door. "Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm closing up for the night." "Thing is," Frank interjected, "we're a bit confused. You turned down every decent proposal in this town. Good men, established men, men with property and prospects. But some drifter shows up and suddenly you're willing?" "My choices are my own," Clara said evenly, "and none of your concern." "That's where you're wrong," Peter said, stepping closer. "When a woman in this town makes decisions that affect the social order, it becomes everyone's concern. You've embarrassed good men, made them look like fools." "I made no one look like anything," Clara snapped, her patience fraying. "You asked. I answered honestly. If you chose to take that personally, that's your failing, not mine." "You think you're too good for us," Jacob accused. "That's what this is about. You and your education and your fancy pies. You needed to be taken down a peg, and Mercer saw an opportunity." Clara's hand tightened on the rifle. "I think you need to leave, now." "Or what?" Frank challenged. "You'll shoot us? Over what, defending our honor?" "Over trespassing and threatening behavior," said a voice from the darkness. Colt stepped into the lamplight from the cabin, materializing from the shadows like a ghost. He must have been watching, waiting, ready to intervene if needed. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "the lady asked you to leave. I suggest you listen." "This doesn't concern you, Mercer," Jacob snarled. "Everything concerning Clara concerns me now," Colt replied. "That's what courting means, and I'm real curious what you boys think you're accomplishing here besides proving you're exactly the kind of men she was right to refuse." The 3 men exchanged glances, calculations running behind their eyes. 3 against 1 should have been good odds, but Colt carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd survived worse confrontations than this, and Clara still held her rifle. "This isn't over," Peter said finally. "Yeah, it is," Colt said. "You're going to walk away. You're going to leave Clara alone, and you're going to accept that she made her choice. Because if you don't, we're going to have a different conversation, one that won't be nearly this polite." They left, muttering threats and insults, disappearing into the winter darkness. Clara lowered her rifle with shaking hands. "You were watching." "Been watching every night since we went public," Colt admitted. "Figured there might be trouble. Men don't like being told no, and they like it even less when the woman who told them no chooses someone else." "You should have told me you were out here." "Would you have let me stay if I had?" Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right. She would have insisted she could handle it herself, would have sent him away out of pride and stubbornness. "Thank you," she said instead. Colt climbed the steps to her porch. "Can I come in? Just for a minute. I want to make sure you're all right." Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted. She led him inside and sank into one of her chairs, her legs unsteady. "I knew there'd be consequences," she said. "I just didn't think they'd be this immediate." Colt knelt in front of her chair, his hands resting gently on her knees. "Those men are cowards and fools. They don't deserve your worry." They could make trouble for you, for both of us. Let them try. Colt's expression was fierce. Clara, I meant what I said. Everything about you concerns me now. That includes protecting you from men who think rejection gives them rights to harassment. I don't need protecting. I know you don't. You'd have handled them fine on your own. He squeezed her knees gently. But you don't have to anymore. That's what this means. Partnership. You've been fighting alone for 2 years. You don't have to keep doing that. Clara felt something break open inside her. A dam holding back 2 years of fear and loneliness and bone-deep exhaustion. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and fierce and long overdue. Colt pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed against his shoulder. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell her to stop. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, his presence solid and real and safe. When the storm finally passed, Clara pulled back, embarrassed. I'm sorry, this isn't... Hush, Colt said gently, wiping tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. You're allowed to cry. You're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to lean on someone. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Clara looked into his eyes and saw no judgment, no disappointment, no expectation that she be anything other than exactly what she was in this moment, tired, scared, and choosing trust anyway. Stay, she whispered, just until I fall asleep. I don't want to be alone tonight. Colt hesitated. Clara, if anyone sees... I don't care, she said fiercely. Let them talk. I'm choosing you, Colt Mercer, publicly and privately. I'm choosing this, so stay. He stayed sitting in the chair beside her bed while she burrowed under her quilts. He told her stories in a low, soothing voice, tales of his childhood, of horses he'd known, of stars he'd slept under. His voice wove around her like a blanket, warm and protective, until her eyes grew heavy and sleep pulled her under. When she woke in the morning, he was gone. But there was fresh coffee on the stove and a note on her table in careful handwriting. Didn't want to compromise your reputation more than necessary. See you at our usual time. See. Clara smiled and started her morning baking with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The armor was gone now. The walls had fallen. And standing in the ruins was something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Winter deepened its grip on Silver Ridge, and with it came a transformation in Clara's world that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The courtship that had begun in secret lessons and stolen conversations now bloomed openly despite the harsh season. Colt no longer arrived alone at her cabin. Sometimes he brought Thomas Riley, establishing propriety through the presence of his employer. Other times he convinced Clara to close her business early and ride with him to the Double R, where she met the other ranch hands and saw the life he was building. The ranch itself surprised her. She'd expected rough accommodations and rougher men, but Thomas ran a tight operation. The bunkhouse was clean, the horses well tended, the land managed with an eye toward sustainability rather than quick profit, and Colt had carved out a place for himself there that went beyond simple labor. He's got a mind for the work, Thomas told Clara one afternoon while Colt was out checking fence lines. They sat in the ranch house kitchen, Clara nursing coffee while Thomas's wife Mary kneaded bread. Most hands do what they're told and nothing more. Colt sees 3 steps ahead, sees patterns in the herd behavior, anticipates problems before they develop. I've been ranching 30 years, and he's teaching me things. Mary smiled at Clara over her bread dough. What Thomas means is he's hoping Colt stays permanent. We're not getting any younger, and good help is hard to find. I'm not that old, Thomas protested, but his eyes were kind when he looked at his wife. They'd been married 25 years, Mary had told Clara, and the affection between them was evident in every interaction. Clara found herself watching them carefully, studying the small intimacies of long partnership. The way Mary poured Thomas's coffee without asking how he took it. The way Thomas reached out to squeeze his wife's hand in passing. The comfortable silence that spoke of 2 people who'd run out of need to fill every moment with words. Was this what she and Colt could become? The thought was both alluring and frightening. You're quiet today, Mary observed, settling into a chair across from Clara. Everything all right? Clara hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the risk. I'm not sure how to do this. Any of this. I've spent 2 years convinced I was better off alone, and now I'm courting a man I've known less than 3 months. It feels reckless. Love usually does, Mary said with a knowing smile. You think Thomas and I had some grand plan? We met on a wagon train heading west. Married 3 weeks later in a ceremony performed by a man who might or might not have been an actual minister. 30 years ago this spring, and I still don't know if it was the smartest decision I ever made or the craziest. But you don't regret it? Not for a single day, Mary said firmly. Even through the hard times, and there have been plenty of those, I've never regretted choosing Thomas. Because here's what I learned. Being alone is safe until it becomes its own kind of prison. At some point, you have to decide if you're protecting yourself or just hiding. The words stayed with Clara as she rode back to town with Colt that evening, the winter sunset painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. You've been thinking hard about something, Colt observed as they approached the edge of Silver Ridge. Want to share? Clara considered deflecting, then remembered her promise to honesty. Mary asked me if I was hiding or protecting myself. I'm not sure I know the difference anymore. Colt reined his horse to a stop, and Clara did the same. They sat there in the fading light, breath clouding in the cold air. I think, Colt said slowly, that protecting yourself means being careful about real threats. Hiding means avoiding anything that might hurt, even if it might also make you happy. He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand. Question is, which one am I? A threat to avoid or a risk worth taking? Clara looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. In the dying light, his features were shadowed, but his eyes were steady and sure. You're the most terrifying risk I've ever considered, she admitted, because losing my business or my cabin would hurt. But losing you, that would destroy me, and I've only known you 12 weeks. 13, Colt corrected softly. 13 weeks tomorrow. He squeezed her hand. And for what it's worth, you terrify me too. I've spent 15 years drifting because staying meant risking exactly this kind of attachment, this kind of vulnerability. But Clara, I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you. Before she could second-guess herself, Clara leaned across the gap between horses and kissed him. It was brief and awkward, complicated by the cold and the angles and the fact that both horses shifted at the unexpected movement, but it was real. When she pulled back, Colt was staring at her with wonder. Well, he said, his voice rough. That's new. Too fast? Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. Not fast enough, Colt replied, and kissed her again, properly this time, his hand cupping her face while the winter wind swirled snow around them and the last light faded from the sky. They rode the rest of the way to town in silence, but it was the comfortable kind, the silence of two people who'd crossed a threshold and were still processing what lay on the other side. December arrived with brutal cold and sparse sunlight, but also with an unexpected invitation. Thomas and Mary were hosting a winter gathering at the Double R, a chance for neighboring ranchers and their families to socialize before the deepest snows made travel impossible. You should come, Colt said when he delivered the invitation. Mary specifically asked for you, said she wanted to introduce you properly to the community. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. Large gatherings meant scrutiny, judgment, the weight of expectations she'd spent 2 years avoiding, but she saw the hope in Colt's eyes and remembered Mary's words about hiding versus protecting. I'll come, she said, but I'm bringing pie. The gathering was larger than Clara had anticipated. Nearly 40 people crowded into the Double R Ranch house, filling it with warmth and noise and the particular chaos of frontier socializing. Children ran underfoot while adults clustered in groups, discussing weather and cattle prices and the latest news from Denver. Clara arrived with Colt and 4 pies, 2 apple, 2 cherry, and was immediately swept into Mary's orbit. The older woman introduced her around with obvious pleasure, presenting Clara not as the pie lady, but as Colt's Clara, a designation that made Clara's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't quite name. Most people were friendly, curious about the woman who'd captured the attention of Thomas Riley's promising new ranch hand. A few were cool, clearly reserving judgment, and some, particularly the younger single women, regarded Clara with thinly veiled resentment. Don't mind them, Mary whispered as they prepared coffee in the kitchen. They had their eyes on Colt themselves. Can't blame them. Eligible men are scarce out here, but he only ever had eyes for you. How could you tell? Clara asked. He'd only been here a few weeks when you met me. Mary laughed. Because he talked about you constantly. The pie lady said this. Clara told me that. Thomas teased him mercilessly about it, said he'd never seen a man fall so hard so fast. She paused, studying Clara with shrewd kindness. You love him, don't you? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Clara's careful deflections failed her. Yes, she admitted quietly. I do. I didn't mean to. I tried not to, but yes. Does he know? No. Clara gripped the coffee pot tighter. It's too soon. We've barely courted 3 months. Saying it now would be… Honest? Mary suggested gently. Clara, I've watched you two together. That man loves you with everything he has. He's just waiting for you to be ready to hear it. Before Clara could respond, Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but Thomas wants to make an announcement. Asked if everyone could gather in the main room. They filed out with the other guests, finding spaces along the walls while Thomas stood by the fireplace. The big rancher waited until the room settled, then cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming tonight, he began. Mary and I are grateful for good neighbors and good friends, especially heading into the hard months. He paused, his eyes finding Colt in the crowd. But I also wanted to make a particular announcement tonight, while we're all together. As most of you know, I've been looking for someone to take over as ranch foreman. The work's getting harder on these old bones, and I need someone I can trust to help run the operation. Clara felt Colt stiffen beside her. I'm pleased to announce that Colt Mercer has accepted the position, effective immediately. He's proven himself more than capable these past months, and I'm proud to have him as my foreman and my partner in this enterprise. The room erupted in applause and congratulations. Men shook Colt's hand while women smiled and nodded. Clara stood frozen, processing the magnitude of what she'd just heard. Foreman wasn't just a job, it was a position of authority and permanence. It meant Colt wasn't passing through, he was planting roots, building a future. And he hadn't told her. When the crowd finally dispersed back into smaller conversations, Clara pulled Colt aside into the relative privacy of the hallway. When were you going to mention this? She asked, trying to keep her voice level. Colt had the grace to look sheepish. Thomas only offered yesterday. I was going to tell you tomorrow, wanted to do it properly. But he wanted to make the announcement tonight, and I couldn't exactly refuse. That's not the point. Clara struggled to articulate the tangle of emotions in her chest. This is a major decision. It changes everything, and you made it without talking to me. I made it because of you, Colt said quietly. Thomas made it clear the job was contingent on me staying permanent. No more drifting, no more temporary positions. And I said yes because I want to stay. Because you're here, and I'm building a life, and I want that life to include you. You should have asked me first. Would you have wanted me to turn it down? Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. The honest answer was no. She wouldn't have wanted him to refuse such an opportunity. But the fact that he'd made a decision about their shared future without consulting her felt like a crack in the foundation they were building. I would have wanted to be part of the decision, she said finally. Not just the outcome. Partnership means sharing the choices, not just the consequences. Colt's expression shifted from defensive to understanding. You're right. I'm sorry. I got excited about the opportunity and didn't think about how it would look to you, like I was deciding our future unilaterally. Were you? No, he said firmly, but I can see why it feels that way. He took her hands in his. Clara, I want to build a life with you, not for you or at you, with you. That means talking about these things, making decisions together. I'm still learning how to do that, but I promise I'm trying. The sincerity in his voice eased some of Clara's anger. She squeezed his hands, then pulled back. I need some air, just for a minute. She slipped outside into the cold night, wrapping her shawl tighter against the wind. The ranch yard was quiet, the party sounds muffled by the thick log walls. Stars blazed overhead in the clear winter sky, so bright and numerous they seemed unreal. She'd come so far from the terrified, isolated woman she'd been 13 weeks ago. But moments like this reminded her how fragile her newfound trust still was, how easily old fears could resurface and whisper that depending on someone else meant losing control. Thought I might find you out here. Clara turned to see Mary approaching, a thick coat wrapped around her shoulders. Sorry, Clara said. Didn't mean to cause a scene. You didn't cause anything, Mary said, joining her at the fence rail. You had a legitimate reaction to finding out important news in front of 40 people. Colt's a good man, but men can be thoughtless sometimes about these things. He said he made the decision because of me. Because of us. And that scares you, Mary observed, because it means he's serious. It means this isn't just a pleasant courtship that might fade when spring comes. It's real and permanent and demands something from you. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Can I tell you something? Mary asked. When Thomas proposed, I said no. Twice, actually. Because accepting meant admitting that I needed him, and I'd spent my whole life being told that needing anyone made you weak. My mother had needed my father desperately, and when he left, she fell apart. I swore I'd never put myself in that position. What changed your mind? I realized that needing someone and choosing someone are different things, Mary said. My mother needed my father because she couldn't function without him. I chose Thomas because I function better with him. There's power in that choice, Clara. Power in saying, I could survive alone, but I choose not to. The words settled into Clara's chest like stones finding the bottom of a river. She'd been so focused on proving she didn't need anyone that she'd almost missed the point. Choosing was stronger than needing. I do choose him, Clara said softly. That's what terrifies me. I choose him so completely that losing him would break something in me I'm not sure I could fix. Then maybe, Mary suggested gently, the answer isn't to protect yourself from that possibility. Maybe it's to hold on tight and trust that he's choosing you just as completely. Clara stayed outside a while longer after Mary returned to the party, thinking about choices and trust and the kind of courage it took to build rather than simply survive. When she finally went back inside, she found Colt in conversation with several ranchers, discussing spring calving plans with the easy confidence of a man who belonged. She watched him for a moment. This man who'd ridden into her life on a winter morning and systematically dismantled every defense she'd built. He looked up, caught her eye across the room, and smiled. It was a private smile meant only for her, and it held a question. Are we all right? Clara smiled back and his shoulders relaxed with visible relief. They were all right, or they would be, as long as they kept choosing each other. The party wound down near midnight. Guests bundled into coats and headed home through the frozen darkness, calling goodbyes and promises to visit before spring. Colt prepared to ride Clara back to town, but Thomas stopped him. Storm's coming, the rancher said, pointing to the northwestern horizon where clouds were gathering like a dark army. Fast one, too, from the look of it. You two should stay the night, head back in the morning when we can see what we're riding through. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. Staying overnight meant more gossip, more complications. But even as she opened her mouth to decline, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, they'd thickened to a white curtain that obliterated everything beyond 10 feet. I've got the spare room made up, Mary said firmly. Clara, you'll take that. Colt, you can bunk with the hands. No arguments from either of you. I won't have you freezing to death out of some misguided concern for propriety. So Clara found herself in a small but comfortable guest room, lying in an unfamiliar bed and listening to the storm rage outside. Sleep eluded her despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept turning over the events of the evening, the announcement, the argument, the conversation with Mary, the smile across a crowded room. A soft knock at her door made her sit up. Yes? It's me, Colt's voice came through the wood. Can I talk to you, just for a minute? Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and opened the door. Colt stood in the hallway in his shirt and trousers, hair mussed, looking uncertain. I couldn't sleep, he admitted. Kept thinking about earlier, about how I handled things wrong. You already apologized. I know, but I don't think I really explained. He ran a hand through his hair. When Thomas offered the foreman position, my first thought wasn't about the money or the authority or any of that. It was about you, about being able to offer you something more than a drifter's wages, about being the kind of man who could provide stability and security and a future worth sharing. I never asked you to be that man, Clara said softly. I know. That's what makes you different from anyone I've ever met. Colt leaned against the doorframe. You don't need me to rescue you or provide for you or make decisions for you. You're the strongest, most capable person I know, but I want to be worthy of you anyway. I want to build something good enough, solid enough, that when I ask you to share it with me, you'll actually consider saying yes. Clara's breath caught. Colt, I'm not proposing, he said quickly. Not yet. I know it's too soon. We've only been courting 3 months, and you need time. I get that. But Clara, I need you to know that's where this is heading for me. I'm not courting you for fun or companionship or to pass the winter. I'm courting you because I want to marry you, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and undeniable. "You weren't supposed to say that yet," Clara whispered. "I know, but I'm tired of pretending I don't feel it." "You can take all the time you need to figure out how you feel. I'm not going anywhere, but I won't lie to you about where I stand." Clara looked at this man who'd somehow become essential to her existence in less than 4 months, who'd seen through her defenses to the lonely, frightened woman beneath and chosen her anyway, who was standing in a hallway at midnight during a blizzard, risking rejection because he valued honesty more than pride. "I love you too," she said, the words escaping before caution could stop them. "I've been trying not to because it's too fast and too risky and completely insane. But I love you, Colt Mercer. I think I have since the day you rode through a snowstorm for pie." Colt's expression transformed, relief and joy, and something deeper flooding his features. He stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. Clara melted into him, the blanket falling forgotten from her shoulders as his arms wrapped around her waist. For a moment there was nothing but this, the taste of him, the warmth of his body against hers, the rightness of being held by someone who saw all of her and loved her anyway. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "Before I forget myself entirely and compromise your virtue beyond all redemption." Clara laughed shakily. Probably wise. But neither of them moved. They stood there in the doorway, holding each other while the storm raged outside and the future waited, no longer quite so terrifying because they'd be facing it together. 3 more months, Colt said eventually. "Give me 3 more months of proper courtship. Let the town get used to seeing us together. Let yourself get used to the idea forever. And then I'm going to ask you to marry me, Clara Whitlock. And I'm hoping with everything I have that you'll say yes." 3 months, Clara agreed. "But Colt, I can tell you right now what my answer will be." His eyes searched hers, hope and fear warring in their depths. "What will it be?" Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Ask me in 3 months and find out." She kissed him once more, quick and sweet, then gently pushed him toward the stairs. "Good night, Colt." "Good night, Clara." She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing, her whole body singing with joy and terror in equal measure. She'd done it. She'd admitted she loved him. She'd opened herself to the possibility of forever with another person. And the world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. She was still herself, still strong, still capable, still independent, but no longer alone. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs to find Mary cooking while Thomas and Colt shoveled paths through the snow. "Morning," Mary greeted her with a knowing smile. "Sleep well?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Well enough. Thank you for the hospitality." "Any time." Mary handed her a cup of coffee. "Though something tells me you'll be spending more nights here in the future, once you and Colt are married, I mean. We're not—" "He hasn't. Yet," Mary finished, laughing. "But he will. That boy looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. And you look at him the same way, whether you realize it or not." Clara sipped her coffee to hide her smile. 3 months, Colt had said. 13 weeks until he'd asked the question they both already knew the answer to. 3 months to prepare herself for the biggest leap of faith she'd ever take. 3 months to transform from a woman who survived alone into a woman who chose to build something with another person. As she watched Colt through the window, his breath clouding in the cold air, his movements efficient and strong, Clara felt certainty settle in her bones. She'd spent 2 years proving she didn't need anyone. Now she had 3 months to embrace an even harder truth. She didn't need Colt Mercer to survive. But she wanted him anyway. Wanted the partnership and the laughter and the quiet moments and the shared dreams. Wanted to see where this terrifying, wonderful thing between them might lead. Wanted for the first time in her life to choose love over safety. The realization was both liberating and frightening. But as Colt looked up, saw her in the window and waved with a grin that made her heart skip, Clara waved back. 3 months. She could wait 3 months. and then she'd step off the cliff and trust that he'd be there to catch her. Or better yet, that they'd catch each other. The 3 months that followed were the strangest, most wonderful, most terrifying period of Clara's life. January arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned water to ice in seconds. Silver Ridge hunkered down for the worst of winter, a town holding its collective breath until spring might offer relief. But inside Clara's cabin, warmth bloomed like an unexpected garden. Colt came every day, as he had since that first morning weeks ago. But now he came with purpose beyond pie and conversation. He brought lumber and spent afternoons reinforcing Clara's shed against the snow load. He brought supplies from the ranch, flour and sugar that Thomas insisted were payment for the pies Clara had been sending to feed the hands. He brought news from the wider world, stories from neighboring ranches, plans for spring that always seemed to include her. And every evening before he left, he kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her forget the cold existed. "You're spoiling me," Clara said one afternoon, watching him repair a crack in her cabin wall. "I've managed this place alone for 2 years." "I know you have," Colt replied, working mortar between the logs. "You're perfectly capable of doing everything yourself. But just because you can doesn't mean you should have to." "What if I like my independence?" Colt set down his tools and turned to face her. "Independence and partnership aren't opposites, Clara. You can be fully yourself and still let someone help carry the load. That's what I'm trying to show you, that choosing to share your life doesn't mean losing it." Clara absorbed this, watching him work with flour-dusted hands that still bore the marks of her morning baking. He was right, and the proof was in how she felt these days, not diminished by his presence, but expanded by it. As if she'd been living in a smaller version of herself and was finally stretching to her full height. "Tell me about your plans for the Double R," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Thomas mentioned you have ideas for expanding the herd." Colt's face lit up the way it always did when discussing ranch business. He launched into an explanation of breeding strategies and grazing rotation, his hands moving to illustrate his points. Clara listened, fascinated not just by the content, but by his passion for it. This wasn't just a job to him. It was a calling, a way to build something lasting. "The thing is," he said, "Thomas wants to retire in 5 years. Not completely, but step back from daily operations. He's offered me a partnership stake if I can prove myself over the next few years. Build up the operation, increase profits, show I can manage both the business and the men." "That's a tremendous opportunity," Clara said, pride swelling in her chest. "It is," Colt agreed, "but it's also a lot of pressure. If I fail, I don't just lose the job. I lose the chance to build something permanent, to prove I'm more than just another drifter who couldn't settle." Clara heard the vulnerability beneath his words. For all his confidence, Colt carried his own fears about worthiness and belonging. "You won't fail," she said firmly. "I've seen how you work, how the other hands respect you, how Thomas trusts your judgment. You're not a drifter anymore, Colt. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You make me believe that," he murmured against her hair. "You make me believe I can be the man I want to be." "You already are that man," Clara whispered. "You just needed to stop running long enough to see it." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, and Clara felt the weight of their shared future settling around them like a comfortable blanket. 3 months had seemed long when he'd first suggested it. Now, with half of January already gone, it felt suddenly short. The town continued to watch their courtship with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. Most had accepted that Clara and Colt were a fixture now, their relationship as much a part of Silver Ridge as the mine itself. But there were still those who muttered about impropriety, about the speed of their attachment, about a woman who'd refused good offers only to accept a cowboy with more charm than prospects. Clara had learned to ignore most of it. But when Jacob Morrison started spreading rumors that Colt was only interested in Clara's property and savings, her tolerance snapped. She found him outside the saloon on a bitter February morning, drunk despite the early hour, holding court with a group of miners. "Morning, Jacob," Clara said pleasantly, though her eyes were ice. "Heard you've been sharing some interesting theories about my relationship with Colt." Jacob's face flushed, but alcohol made him bold. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. Man shows up out of nowhere, courts the richest unmarried woman in town, gets himself a foreman position. Convenient timing is all I'm saying. The richest unmarried woman in town, Clara repeated slowly. Jacob, I own a one-room cabin and a pie business. My savings wouldn't buy a decent horse. If Colt wanted money, he'd have courted any of the actual wealthy families in the territory. The fact that you think I'm some great prize tells me more about your delusions than his motives. The miners laughed, and Jacob's flush deepened to crimson. You think you're so smart, he snarled, but you're just a lonely woman who fell for the first man who paid her attention. When he gets tired of you, and he will, don't come crying to the rest of us. I won't, Clara said calmly, because I learned a long time ago that a man's true character shows in how he treats a woman who doesn't need him. Colt chose me knowing full well I could survive without him. You offered to marry me because you needed a cook and a housekeeper. See the difference? She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding with anger and satisfaction in equal measure. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She knew the truth, and so did Colt. When she told him about the confrontation that evening, Colt's jaw tightened with fury. I should have a conversation with Morrison. Make it clear that spreading lies about you isn't acceptable. No, Clara said firmly. That's exactly what he wants. To provoke a fight, make you look unstable, validate his narrative that you're not good enough for me. The best revenge is ignoring him while we build something he'll never have. Colt studied her for a long moment, then smiled. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Clara replied. I just used to hide it better. February brought a brief thaw that turned the streets to rivers of mud, then a hard freeze that transformed everything to treacherous ice. The Double R lost 3 calves to the cold, and Thomas worked himself to exhaustion trying to save the rest. Colt spent 18-hour days at the ranch, and Clara saw him only in brief stolen moments, a quick visit for coffee, a kiss at her door before he rode back into the frozen darkness. She missed him with an intensity that surprised her. The cabin felt emptier now when he wasn't in it, as if his presence had expanded the space and his absence shrank it back to loneliness. She'd grown accustomed to his voice, his laughter, the particular way he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Only 6 more weeks, Mary reminded her when Clara rode to the Double R with food for the exhausted ranch hands. Then I'll ask, and you'll say yes, and you can stop living in this limbo. What if something goes wrong? Clara asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of her mind. What if the ranch fails, or Thomas changes his mind about the partnership, or what if everything works out exactly as planned? Mary interrupted gently. Clara, you can't protect yourself from disappointment by expecting it. That's not caution. That's just another kind of giving up. The words stung because they were true. Clara was still trying to hedge her bets, to keep one foot out the door even as she claimed to be all in. It was a habit born of 2 years of survival, but it was also a refusal to fully trust in the future she and Colt were building. That night, lying alone in her bed, Clara made a decision. When Colt asked, and he would ask, she had no doubt now, she would say yes without reservation. No conditions, no escape clauses, no careful protection of her independence. She would choose partnership with the same wholehearted commitment she'd once given to solitude. The decision brought peace and terror in equal measure. March arrived with the first hints of spring, longer days, warmer winds, the sound of water running beneath the ice as snowmelt began its inevitable journey to the valleys below. The town stirred from its winter hibernation like a bear waking from sleep, blinking and stretching and remembering what it felt like to move freely. Colt's visits became regular again, though they were different now. There was an anticipation in the air between them, a sense of something approaching that both thrilled and sobered them. He'd promised 3 months, and March marked the end of that timeline. Clara found herself watching the calendar with mixed emotions. She wanted him to ask. She was terrified of him asking. She knew her answer and questioned it constantly. The contradictions exhausted her. You're going to wear a hole in that floor with your pacing, Colt observed one afternoon, catching her mid-circuit around the cabin. Clara stopped, realizing she'd been walking in circles while supposedly preparing pie filling. Sorry, I'm distracted. I noticed. He stood from the chair where he'd been watching her work. Want to talk about what's distracting you? Not particularly. Fair enough. But he didn't return to his seat. Instead, he approached slowly, as if she were a spooked horse that might bolt. Clara, can I ask you something? Her heart jumped. This was it. He was going to ask now, early, before she was ready. What? Why are you afraid? The question was so unexpected that Clara answered honestly. Because I've never been this happy, and happiness feels dangerous, like a debt I'll have to pay back with interest. Colt's expression softened. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's practical, Clara defended. In my experience, good things don't last. They get taken away, or they turn out to be illusions, or they cost more than you realized you were agreeing to pay. Is that what you think I am? Colt asked quietly. An illusion that's going to cost you everything? No, Clara said immediately. You're real. This is real. That's what scares me. If it wasn't real, losing it wouldn't matter. Colt closed the remaining distance between them and took her hands. I can't promise you'll never lose me. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that whatever time we have, whether it's 5 years or 50, I'll spend it choosing you every single day, choosing us, building something that matters even if it eventually ends. That's not comforting, Clara said, but she squeezed his hands. No, he agreed. But it's honest. And I think you value honesty more than comfort. He was right, she did. And his willingness to acknowledge the risks rather than dismiss them made her trust him more, not less. I'm working on it, she said finally, on believing that good things can last, that I deserve them, that choosing happiness isn't the same as tempting fate. Take all the time you need, Colt said. I'm not going anywhere. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The crisis came on a Thursday in mid-March, when an early spring storm, the kind that could be worse than anything winter threw at you, rolled in with devastating speed. Thomas had taken a crew to check the northern pastures, and they'd been caught in the blizzard. By the time they made it back to the ranch house, Thomas was showing signs of frostbite and exposure. Mary sent word to Clara, asking her to come help nurse him. Clara closed her business without hesitation and rode through the tail end of the storm to the Double R, her medical supplies packed carefully in her saddlebags. She found Thomas in bed, his extremities blackened, his breathing labored. Mary sat beside him, her face drawn with fear and exhaustion. Thank heavens, Mary said when Clara entered. I've done what I can, but your mother taught you healing. Please, Clara, tell me what to do. Clara assessed Thomas with the clinical eye her mother had trained into her. The frostbite was severe, but not hopeless. His lungs were stressed but clear. The danger was infection and the shock to his system from the rapid temperature change. We need to warm him slowly, Clara instructed, falling into the role her mother had prepared her for, even as she'd rebelled against it. Too fast and will do more damage. Mary, I need you to prepare willow bark tea for the pain and fever. Colt, help me with his boots. We need to examine his feet. They worked through the night, the three of them moving in careful coordination. Clara directed treatment based on half-remembered lessons from her childhood, when her mother had treated everyone from snake bites to childbirth complications. She'd resented those lessons at the time, had seen them as another way her mother tried to shape her into someone she wasn't. Now she was grateful for every word, every demonstration, every piece of knowledge her mother had insisted she learn. Thomas's fever spiked near dawn. Mary wept quietly while Colt paced, both of them helpless in the face of the man's suffering. But Clara remained calm, adjusting poultices, monitoring his breathing, forcing fluids when he could swallow. How do you know what to do? Colt asked as the first light crept through the windows. My mother, Clara said simply. She believed every woman should know how to heal, said it was the most important skill a frontier wife could have. She paused, wringing out a cool cloth to place on Thomas's forehead. I hated learning it. Thought it was just another way she was trying to control who I became, but she was preparing me, making sure I'd have what I needed to survive, to help others survive. She'd be proud of you, Mary said quietly. Clara looked at the older woman and saw her own mother's face superimposed, the same determination, the same fierce protectiveness, the same belief that strength came from knowledge and preparation. How much of her own survival had been built on foundations her mother laid, even as she'd rebelled against them. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe she'd say this was the plan all along, that I'd eventually understand why she pushed so hard. Thomas's fever broke an hour after sunrise. He opened his eyes, confused and weak but conscious. Mary collapsed in relief, and Colt steadied her with shaking hands. You saved him, Mary said to Clara. If you hadn't been here, I was here, Clara interrupted gently. That's what matters. But as she packed her supplies to head home, exhausted and emotionally drained, Clara understood something she'd been resisting for years. Her mother hadn't been trying to control her. She'd been trying to equip her. Every lesson, every skill, every piece of knowledge had been a gift, even when it felt like obligation. And Clara had used those gifts to build exactly the life her mother had hoped for her. Not the missionary's wife her father envisioned, but a woman strong enough to stand alone and wise enough to choose partnership. She was crying when Colt found her in the barn, saddling her horse for the ride home. "Hey," he said softly, taking the saddle from her trembling hands. "You've been awake for 36 hours. Let me do this." Clara let him take over, too tired to protest. "I spent so long being angry at my parents, at their dreams, their expectations, their complete failure to understand the world they'd dragged me into. But my mother gave me everything I needed to survive it. She knew, even if my father didn't. She knew this life would be hard and lonely and dangerous, and she made sure I'd be ready." Colt finished with the saddle and pulled her into his arms. "She prepared you to stand alone, but that doesn't mean you have to keep doing it." "I know," Clara whispered against his chest. "I'm finally starting to understand that." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet barn while the morning sun painted everything gold. When Clara finally pulled back, she felt different, lighter, despite her exhaustion, as if she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't known was there and had finally set it down. "Colt," she said, "I don't want to wait anymore." He looked at her quizzically. "Wait for what?" "For you to ask." Clara took a breath, steadying herself for the leap. "I know you wanted 3 more weeks, but I don't need them. I know my answer. I've known it for weeks, maybe months. So ask me. Please." Colt's eyes widened. "Clara, you're exhausted. You're emotional from the crisis. This isn't the time. This is exactly the time," Clara interrupted. "I just spent the night fighting to save Thomas's life, using skills my mother taught me, in a house owned by a couple who chose love over safety 30 years ago and never regretted it. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for the perfect moment that might never come. So ask me, Colt Mercer. Ask me now." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then slowly, he sank to one knee in the straw-covered barn floor, taking her hand in both of his. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I was going to commission one from the jeweler in town, wanted it to be perfect." "I don't need a ring," Clara said, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "I just need you." Colt smiled, and it was the same smile that had transformed his face that first day outside her cabin, genuine and unguarded and full of hope. "Clara Whitlock, I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another person. You're the strongest, smartest, most stubborn woman I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Clara said, the word bursting out of her like something that had been waiting its whole life to be spoken. "Yes, absolutely yes." Colt surged to his feet and kissed her, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle while she laughed against his mouth. When he finally set her down, they were both grinning like fools. "I'm going to be a terrible ranch wife," Clara warned. "I don't know anything about cattle, and I'll probably keep running my pie business. And I'm going to need my own space sometimes because I'm not used to sharing my life." "I'm going to hold you to all of that," Colt interrupted. "I don't want a traditional ranch wife. I want you, Clara, exactly as you are, with your business and your independence and your need for space. All of it." "What about the town? They're going to have opinions about how we do things." "Let them," Colt said. "We'll build our life our way. Together." Together. The word no longer terrified her. Instead, it promised possibility. 2 people stronger as a unit than they'd ever been apart. "We should tell Thomas and Mary," Clara said, "before word spreads through town via the usual gossip channels." "Agreed." Colt took her hand and led her back toward the house. "Though I suspect Mary already knows. That woman has an uncanny ability to see the future." They found Mary and Thomas in the kitchen, Thomas wrapped in blankets at the table while Mary prepared breakfast. Both looked up when Clara and Colt entered, and Mary's face split into a knowing grin. "So?" she asked. "Did someone finally get around to proposing?" "How did you—" Colt started, but Mary waved him off. "Please, You two have been circling each other like lovesick fools for months. About time you made it official." She turned to Thomas. "Pay up. I said he'd ask before the end of March." Thomas groaned, reaching for his pocket. "I had money on April." He handed over several bills to his wife, then turned to Clara and Colt with a warm smile. "Congratulations, both of you. Couldn't be happier." "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything. For giving Colt a chance, for accepting me into your family, for showing me what a good partnership looks like." "Family takes care of family," Mary said firmly. "And your family now, official or not? Though speaking of official, when are you thinking for the wedding?" Clara and Colt exchanged glances. They hadn't gotten that far in their planning. "Soon," Clara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I don't want a big ceremony or months of preparation, just something simple and real." "May," Colt suggested. "Early May, when the wildflowers are blooming. Marry me in the meadow behind your cabin with just family and close friends. Nothing fancy, just honest." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, happy tears this time. "Perfect, that's perfect." Mary clapped her hands together. "May it is. I'll start planning, simple, like you want. Just the important people, good food, and a celebration of two stubborn fools finally figuring out what everyone else already knew." They spent the rest of the morning at the ranch, helping Mary care for Thomas and making preliminary plans for the wedding. By the time Clara finally headed home in the early afternoon, she was so exhausted she could barely stay in the saddle. But she was also happier than she'd ever been in her life. She'd said yes. She was getting married. She was choosing partnership and love and a future she couldn't control. And for the first time in her adult life, that didn't terrify her. It exhilarated her. The news spread through Silver Ridge with predictable speed. By the time Clara opened her business the next morning, half the town seemed to have heard about the engagement. Some offered congratulations. Others offered advice she hadn't requested and didn't want. A few muttered about the speed of things, about Clara finally getting what they'd predicted she'd never find. Clara ignored them all and baked pies with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the spring weather. That evening, Colt appeared at her door with a small wooden box. "I know you said you didn't need a ring," he said, holding it out. "But I wanted you to have this anyway." Clara opened the box and found not a ring but a delicate gold locket. She lifted it carefully, examining the intricate engraving on the front. Two birds in flight, wings nearly touching. "It was my mother's," Colt explained. "The only thing she owned that was truly hers. She gave it to me before she died and told me to give it to the woman I loved enough to stop running for." He helped Clara fasten it around her neck. "I think she'd approve of you. You're exactly the kind of woman she hoped I'd find. Strong enough to stand on your own, brave enough to take a chance on someone like me." Clara touched the locket, feeling its weight settle against her chest like a promise. "I'll treasure it, thank you." "You're welcome." Colt pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. 53 days until the wedding. Think you can put up with me that long?" "I'm going to put up with you for the rest of our lives," Clara replied. 53 days is nothing. But in truth, each day felt both too long and too short. Too long because she was impatient to begin their married life. Too short because there was so much to prepare, so much to absorb about the magnitude of the choice she'd made. She was marrying Colt Mercer. She was becoming Clara Mercer. She was stepping out of the solitary life she'd built and into a partnership that would require constant negotiation, compromise, and trust. And she couldn't wait. The 53 days contracted and expanded like a living thing, each one bringing Clara closer to a future she'd stopped fearing and started embracing with both hands. April transformed the Colorado landscape from winter's monochrome into an explosion of color. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, lupine and columbine, Indian paintbrush and wild roses. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind rivers swollen with meltwater and valleys green with new grass. The Double R's cattle grew fat on spring grazing, and Thomas recovered enough to ride again, though Mary watched him like a hawk and limited his hours. Clara divided her time between her pie business, which had become more popular than ever, and preparing for the wedding with Mary's enthusiastic help. The older woman had taken charge of the practical details while respecting Clara's desire for simplicity. No fancy dress, no elaborate decorations, just honest celebration among people who mattered. "You're sure about the cabin, Meadow?" Mary asked one afternoon while they sat on Clara's porch, ostensibly mending linens, but mostly just enjoying the spring sunshine. We could have the ceremony at the ranch, more room for guests. I'm sure, Clara said firmly. My parents are buried behind that cabin. It feels right to start this new chapter with them as witnesses, even if they can't be here in person. She paused, threading her needle through the fabric. I think they'd approve. Not of the life I've built, maybe. That's nothing like what they envisioned for me. But of Colt. Of the choice to build something with someone rather than alone. Your mother would be proud, Mary said. Any woman would be proud to see her daughter become what you've become. Strong, independent, wise enough to recognize love when it finds her. Clara touched the locket at her throat, a gesture that had become habit in the weeks since Colt had given it to her. I hope so. I spent so long being angry at them for dying and leaving me alone. But lately, I've been thinking about what they gave me before they left. My father gave me stubbornness and principles. My mother gave me practical skills and the belief that I could survive anything. Together, they gave me the foundation to build this life. And now you're building on that foundation with Colt, Mary observed, adding another floor to the structure. Exactly, Clara smiled. Though I suspect it's going to be messy construction. We're both stubborn, both used to making our own decisions. We'll probably fight. Of course you'll fight, Mary said with a laugh. Every couple fights. The difference between a marriage that lasts and one that crumbles is whether you fight to win or fight to understand. You and Colt strike me as the understanding type. Clara hoped she was right. The weeks since their engagement had been mostly smooth, but there had been moments of friction, disagreements about where they'd live after the wedding, about how to merge their finances, about how much time Clara would continue to devote to her business. They'd worked through each conflict with patience and compromise. But Clara knew the real test would come after marriage, when the novelty wore off and the daily grind of partnership revealed all the ways two people could rub each other wrong. But she was ready for those tests, or as ready as anyone could be. The bigger challenge came from an unexpected source, her own success. Word of Clara's pies had spread beyond Silver Ridge over the winter, carried by travelers and miners who'd moved on to other towns. In mid-April, a businessman named Harrison Webb arrived from Denver with an offer that would have seemed like a dream a year ago. I own 3 restaurants in Denver, Webb explained, sitting in Clara's cabin with a cup of coffee and an untouched slice of cherry pie. I'm always looking for suppliers who can provide quality baked goods. Your reputation has reached the city, Miss Whitlock. I'd like to offer you a contract, 24 pies per week at premium prices, delivered to Denver via the weekly supply wagon. Clara stared at him, her mind racing through the implications. 24 pies weekly would triple her current income. It would establish her business beyond the local market. It would prove that her success was replicable and sustainable, not just a product of limited competition in a small town. It would also consume every waking hour and require help she didn't currently have. That's a generous offer, Mr. Webb, Clara said carefully. But I'm getting married in 3 weeks. I'm not sure this is the right time to expand my operation. Webb waved a dismissive hand. All the more reason to accept. A woman with a husband can afford to hire help, build a real business rather than a one-woman operation. Think bigger, Miss Whitlock. You could supply half the Front Range if you wanted to. This is just the beginning. After he left, Clara sat at her work table and stared at the contract he'd left behind. The numbers were real, more money than she'd ever imagined making from pie. Enough to transform her modest savings into real security, enough to contribute meaningfully to the household she and Colt would build. But it would require a level of commitment that frightened her. Hiring employees, managing production schedules, maintaining quality control across larger volumes. These were business challenges she'd never faced. And doing it all while navigating the first year of marriage seemed like inviting disaster. When Colt arrived that evening, she showed him the contract without preamble. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. What do you want to do? I don't know, Claire admitted. Part of me wants to sign immediately, prove I can build something bigger than a local pie business. But part of me thinks the timing is terrible. We're about to get married, you're establishing yourself as foreman, Thomas is still recovering. Adding this kind of pressure seems insane. Those are all logistical concerns, Colt said. What does your gut tell you? Clara closed her eyes, trying to hear her instincts beneath the noise of practicality and fear. My gut says I'm afraid. That I'm using the timing as an excuse because scaling up means risking failure on a bigger stage. Right now, if I fail, I only disappoint Silver Ridge. If I take this contract and fail, I disappoint Denver businessmen who'll spread word that I couldn't deliver. And if you succeed? Colt asked gently. If I succeed, I prove that a woman alone in the Colorado Territory can build something that matters. That my parents' deaths weren't the end of my story, but the beginning. That I took their lessons and their loss and made something beautiful from the wreckage. Colt reached across the table and took her hand. Then I think you have your answer. But the timing will never be perfect, Colt interrupted. Clara, there will always be reasons to wait, to play it safe, to avoid risk. But you're not a woman who plays it safe. You pointed a rifle at 3 drunk miners to protect a stranger. You opened your home to a drifter cowboy and let him into your heart. You said yes to marrying me despite every logical reason to protect yourself. This is just another version of that same courage. Clara squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. What if I can't do both? Build a business and build a marriage. Then we'll figure it out together, Colt said. Maybe I help with the baking. Maybe we hire someone from town. Maybe we accept that some weeks will be harder than others and we'll just have to muddle through. But Clara, don't refuse this opportunity because you're afraid of asking for help. I'm going to be your husband. Helping you succeed is part of my job description. That's not how I want our marriage to work, Clara protested. I don't want to be a burden or an obligation. You won't be, Colt said firmly. You'll be my partner, and partners support each other's dreams. This is your dream. Building a business that proves women can succeed on our own terms. I want to help you achieve that. Not because you need me to, but because I love you, and your success makes me proud. Claire looked at this man who'd somehow learned to speak the exact language her heart needed to hear. He wasn't offering to take over or manage her business. He was offering to stand beside her while she built it. The difference was everything. I'll sign the contract, she decided. But with one modification, I start fulfilling it June 1st, after the wedding and after we've had time to settle into married life. That gives me 5 weeks to hire help, establish systems, and make sure I can deliver what I'm promising. Smart, Colt approved. Show them you're serious, but also that you understand sustainable business practices. Webb will respect that. Clara drafted a counterproposal that evening and sent it to Denver with the next supply wagon. Webb's response arrived 10 days later. He accepted her terms and looked forward to a long and profitable partnership. The victory felt sweet, made sweeter by the fact that she'd achieved it not by abandoning her impending marriage, but by incorporating it into her planning. She was learning, slowly, that partnership didn't mean choosing between her dreams and Colt's. It meant finding ways to pursue both simultaneously. The final weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Clara hired Beth Morrison, Jacob's younger sister, who'd been looking for work and jumped at the chance to learn baking, as her first employee. The girl was eager and quick to learn, and Clara found unexpected satisfaction in teaching someone else the skills her mother had taught her. "You're good at this," Colt observed one afternoon, watching Clara demonstrate proper dough handling to Beth. "Teaching, I mean. You're patient and clear, and you actually explain the why behind the technique." "My mother always explained the why," Clara said, crimping a pie edge while Beth watched carefully. She said understanding the reason made you better at the execution. I hated it at the time, wanted her to just tell me what to do. But she was right. When you understand why butter needs to be cold or why you can't overwork the dough, you make better decisions. After Beth left for the day, Colt pulled Clara into his arms. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, and you'll be my wife. 2 weeks, and you'll be my husband, Clara countered. Having second thoughts? Not even for a moment, he kissed her forehead. Though I am having thoughts about where we're going to live. Have you decided? This had been their biggest point of negotiation. Colt had assumed they'd live at the Double R in the foreman's cabin that came with his position. Clara had assumed she'd continue living in her cabin, and he'd split time between locations. The reality was that neither option was perfect. I think, Clara said slowly, that we should live at the ranch. It makes sense with your job, and I can ride to town for business, but I want to keep my cabin. Not sell it or rent it, but keep it as mine. A place I can go when I need space or want to bake without distractions. Colt was quiet for a moment, processing this. You need to know you have a place that's just yours, an escape route if marriage turns out to be a trap. Not an escape route, Clara corrected. A breathing room. I've lived alone for 2 years, Colt. I'm not afraid of marriage, but I am afraid of losing myself in it. Keeping the cabin means I'll always have a piece of independence to hold on to. Then we keep the cabin, Colt said without hesitation. It's yours, Clara. It was yours before me, and it'll be yours after we're married. I'm not asking you to give up pieces of yourself to become my wife. I'm asking you to bring all those pieces into our partnership. Relief flooded through her. You're not angry? Why would I be angry? You're being honest about what you need. That's exactly what I want from you. Always. He tilted her face up to his. Clara, I fell in love with a fierce, independent woman who survived alone and built something extraordinary from nothing. That woman needs her own space sometimes. I can live with that. What I couldn't live with is watching you slowly suffocate because you were trying to be someone you're not. Clara kissed him, pouring every ounce of gratitude and love and relief into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, she was crying again, happy tears that seemed to come so easily these days. I love you, she said. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes. Good, Colt replied. Love should be a little terrifying, means it matters. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the kind of May day that made people understand why settlers had been willing to risk everything for a chance at Western living. The sky stretched blue and infinite overhead, and the meadow behind Clara's cabin blazed with wildflowers in every color imaginable. Mary arrived at dawn to help Clara prepare, shooing Colt away with instructions not to return until the ceremony. Bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, she declared, though everyone knew she just wanted time alone with Clara. Clara's wedding dress was simple, a cream-colored gown that Mary had altered from one of her own dresses, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to Clara's mother. She wore her hair down for the first time in public since her parents' deaths, letting it fall in blonde waves down her back. The locket Colt had given her rested against her heart, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked fresh that morning. You look beautiful, Mary said, tears streaming down her face. Like spring itself decided to take human form. Clara looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy, radiant, hopeful, all the things she'd convinced herself she'd never be again after her parents died. I'm getting married, she said, the reality of it hitting her fully for the first time. In an hour, I'm going to be Clara Mercer. Having second thoughts? Mary asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Not about Colt, Clara said, but about myself. What if I'm terrible at being married? What if I'm too independent, too stubborn, too used to my own way? Mary laughed and took Clara's hands. Then you'll be terrible at being married in exactly the ways Colt expects and loves. Clara, that man knows exactly who you are. He's not expecting you to transform into some docile, obedient wife. He's expecting you to be yourself, strong-willed and independent and occasionally impossible. And he loves you anyway. That's the miracle. The ceremony was small and perfect. 30 people gathered in the wildflower meadow. Ranch hands from the Double R, neighbors from town who'd become friends, Beth Morrison, and a handful of other townspeople who'd supported Clara through the years. Thomas officiated, recovered enough to stand tall and speak clearly despite Mary's worried hovering, but Clara barely noticed any of them. Her entire focus was on Colt, standing at the edge of the meadow in his best clothes, with the mountains rising behind him and the spring sun turning everything gold. When their eyes met, he smiled that transformative smile, and Clara felt every doubt, every fear, every reservation melt away like snow in summer. She walked toward him alone. No father to give her away. No symbolic transfer of ownership from one man to another. She walked to him as an equal, choosing him freely, and when she reached his side and took his hand, it felt like coming home. Thomas's words were simple and heartfelt. He spoke of partnership and respect, of the courage it took to join two lives, of the particular miracle of two stubborn people deciding to be stubborn together. He asked them to make their vows, and Colt went first. Clara, he said, his voice steady and sure, I promise to love you exactly as you are, not as I think you should be. I promise to support your dreams even when they scare me. I promise to give you space when you need it and closeness when you want it. I promise to never take your strength for granted or mistake your independence for not needing me. I promise to build a life with you, not for you, and I promise to choose you every single day for as long as I live." Clara's hands trembled in his as she spoke her own vows. "Colt, I promise to trust you even when trust feels dangerous. I promise to let you help me even when I'm convinced I can do it alone. I promise to fight fair and love fiercely and never let fear make decisions for us. I promise to be honest about what I need and patient when we don't see eye to eye. I promise to choose partnership over isolation, love over safety, and you over everyone else, every single day, forever." Thomas pronounced them married, and Colt kissed her to cheers and applause from their guests. But Clara was crying too hard to hear any of it, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd just done. She'd married Colt Mercer. She'd chosen forever with another person. She'd stepped off the cliff and trusted him to catch her. And he had. The celebration afterward was joyful and chaotic. Food and music and dancing in the meadow until the sun set and the stars emerged. Clara danced with Colt, with Thomas, with several ranch hands who'd become friends. She laughed until her sides hurt and cried happy tears until Mary told her she was going to dehydrate. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Colt pulled Clara away to the edge of the meadow where her parents were buried. They stood there in the darkness, his arm around her waist, looking at the simple wooden crosses that marked the graves. "I wish they could have met you," Clara said quietly. "My father would have lectured you about responsibility and faith. My mother would have interrogated you about your intentions and your ability to provide. But I think eventually they would have approved. I would have endured any lecture, any interrogation, for the privilege of marrying you," Colt said. "Though I like to think I would have passed their tests." "You would have," Clara agreed. "Because you see me as a whole person, not a problem to solve or a prize to win. That's what my mother wanted for me. Someone who valued my mind as much as my skills, my independence as much as my companionship." They stood there for several more minutes, paying quiet respect to the people who'd shaped Clara into the woman she'd become. Then Colt turned her gently toward the future. "Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Mercer?" Clara smiled at the name, her name now, chosen freely and worn with pride. "Ready." They rode to the Double R together under a sky full of stars, and Clara felt the final pieces of her old life settling into place beside the new. She wasn't abandoning the woman who'd survived alone. She was expanding that woman, adding new dimensions, building on the foundation of strength her parents and experience had given her. The years that followed were not easy, but they were rich with purpose and growth. Clara's pie business flourished, expanding beyond the Denver contract to supply restaurants throughout the Front Range. She hired more help, taught other women the skills her mother had taught her, and built a reputation for quality and reliability that opened doors throughout the territory. Colt proved himself an exceptional foreman, and 5 years after their wedding, became Thomas's full partner when the older man finally retired. Together, they expanded the Double R into one of the most successful ranches in Colorado, known for innovative practices and fair treatment of workers. Their marriage weathered the inevitable storms, disagreements about money and time, struggles to balance competing demands, moments when Clara's need for independence clashed with Colt's desire for closeness. But they fought to understand rather than to win, and each conflict resolved made them stronger. Children came, 3 of them over the course of 8 years. Each birth terrified Clara, who'd lost her own mother and knew the risks frontier women faced. But she survived each delivery and found unexpected joy in motherhood, teaching her daughters the same skills of independence and resilience her mother had taught her, while also teaching them something her mother never had, that strength and partnership weren't opposites, that choosing to build a life with someone didn't mean losing yourself. The cabin meadow where they'd married became a family gathering place. Every spring they held a celebration there, remembering the day Clara and Colt had chosen forever. And every time Clara stood in that meadow, she thought about the terrified, lonely woman she'd been and marveled at the life she'd built through courage and choice. On their 20th anniversary, they stood in that same meadow with their children and grandchildren. The ranch had become a family operation by then, with all 3 of their children and their spouses involved in running it. The Double R had grown from a single ranch into a network of properties that employed dozens of families and set standards for ethical ranching throughout the region. Clara's pie business had evolved too. She no longer baked every pie herself, but she'd trained a generation of bakers who carried on her standards. Her recipes were requested by restaurants from Denver to San Francisco, and her name had become synonymous with quality frontier baking. But the real achievement wasn't the business success or the ranch's growth, it was the life they'd built together. A partnership between equals that had transformed two individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. No regrets? Colt asked, pulling her close as the sun set over the mountains. Clara looked at the life spread before her, children laughing, grandchildren playing, the ranch sprawling across the valley below, the business she'd built still thriving, the man beside her who'd loved her exactly as she was for 2 decades. She thought about the scared young woman who'd survived alone, who'd built armor from pie crust and determination, who'd pointed a rifle at strangers and sworn she'd never need anyone. That woman had been brave, but this woman, the one who'd chosen to risk everything for love, who'd built a legacy not of survival but of thriving, who'd proven that independence and partnership could coexist, this woman was fearless. Not a single one, Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The legend of Clara and Colt Mercer spread throughout Colorado and beyond, a story of 2 stubborn people who'd found each other in the harsh frontier and built something beautiful from courage and choice. People told it as a romance, as a business success story, as proof that women could build empires with flour and determination. But to Clara, it was simpler than that. It was the story of a woman who'd learned that the strongest armor wasn't isolation, but connection. That safety wasn't found in walls, but in the willingness to let someone in. That survival was necessary, but living was the real victory. She'd started with nothing but a pie recipe and a determination to never need anyone. She'd ended with everything that mattered: love, family, legacy, and the knowledge that she'd been brave enough to choose life over mere survival. In the end, she wasn't remembered as the woman who survived alone. She was remembered as the woman who'd built something unbreakable from courage, who'd chosen partnership over isolation, who'd proven that the greatest strength wasn't in standing alone, but in knowing when to reach out your hand. Clara Whitlock. Mercer died at 83, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, in the ranch house that had become her home. Her last words, spoken to Colt as he held her hand one final time, were simple. "Thank you for riding through that snowstorm. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me exactly as I was." And Colt, 90 years old and still possessing the smile that had transformed his face on a winter morning decades ago, replied, "Thank you for pointing that rifle. Thank you for taking the risk. Thank you for choosing me." The Colorado frontier was harsh and unforgiving, a place where most people clung to safety and predictability. But Clara had chosen differently. She'd chosen risk, chosen love, chosen to build something extraordinary from courage and pie. And in doing so, she'd written a story that would inspire generations. Not because she'd survived, survival was common in the West, but because she'd dared to truly live, to love fearlessly, to build a legacy that proved women could have it all: independence and partnership, strength and vulnerability, business success and family devotion. Her pies were forgotten within a generation. Her business techniques were superseded by industrial baking. The double R eventually passed out of family hands. But the story endured. The story of a woman alone who became a woman choosing partnership. The story of survival transforming into legacy. The story of courage, not the courage to face down threats, but the courage to open your heart when every instinct screamed to keep it closed. That was Clara's true gift to the world. Not her recipes or her business acumen, or even her family. It was the proof, lived out over decades, that love wasn't weakness, that needing someone didn't diminish you, that the strongest people weren't those who stood alone, but those who were brave enough to build something together. In the wildflower meadow behind a cabin in Silver Ridge, a simple stone marked where it all began. Not her grave, that was in the family plot at the ranch, but a memorial to the day Clara Whitlock married Colt Mercer and chose forever. Every spring, wildflowers still bloomed there in impossible profusion. And if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, some claimed you could still hear laughter echoing across the years, the sound of a woman who'd risked everything and won not just survival, but joy. That was the legacy Clara left behind. Not just a life well lived, but proof that courage came in many forms. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't to stand alone, but to reach out your hand and see who reached back. And in Clara's case, The answer had changed everything.